And even if scientists eventually did create life in the laboratory, it would prove creation. Why? Because their efforts would show that it takes a lot of intelligence to create life. Do Darwinists insist on spontaneous generation because they just don't see the evidence for design? Not at all. In fact, exactly the opposite is true. They see the evidence clearly. For example, Richard Dawkins named his book The Blind Watchmaker in response to William Paley's design argument we cited in the last chapter. The appearance of design in life is admitted on the first page of The Blind Watchmaker. Dawkins writes, "Biology is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose." 2 pages later, despite acknowledging the intricate architecture and precision engineering in human life and in each of the trillions of cells within the human body, Dawkins flatly denies that human life or any other life has been designed. Apparently, Dawkins refuses to allow observation to interfere with his conclusions. This is very strange for a man who believes in the supremacy of science, which is supposed to be based on observation. Francis Crick, co-discoverer of DNA and another ardent Darwinist, agrees with Dawkins about the appearance of design. In fact, the appearance of design is so clear, he warns that biologists must constantly keep in mind that what they see was not designed, but rather evolved. Crick's little memo to biologists led Philip Johnson, author and a leader in the intelligent design movement, to observe, "Darwinian biologists must keep repeating that reminder to themselves, because otherwise they might become conscious of the reality that is staring them in the face and trying to get their attention." The complexity of DNA is not the only problem for Darwinists. Its origin is also a problem. A difficult chicken-egg dilemma exists because DNA relies on proteins for its production, but proteins rely on DNA for their production. So which came first, proteins or DNA? One must already be in existence for the other to be made. So why do Crick, Dawkins, and others in their camp ignore the plain implications of the evidence staring them in the face? Because their preconceived ideology, naturalism, prevents them from even considering an intelligent cause. As we're about to see, this is bad science, and it leads to wrong conclusions. Good science versus bad science. It is commonly believed that the so-called creation-evolution debate, now often called the intelligent design versus naturalism debate, entails a war between religion and science, the Bible and science, or faith and reason. This perception is perpetuated by the media, who consistently depict the debate in terms of the 1960 movie Inherit the Wind, which fictionalized the 1925 Scopes monkey trial. You know that depiction. It basically goes like this. Here comes those crazy religious fundamentalists again, and they want to impose their dogmatic religion and ignore objective science. Actually, nothing could be further from the truth. The creation-evolution debate is not about religion versus science, or the Bible versus science. It's about good science versus bad science. Likewise, it's not about faith versus reason, it's about reasonable faith versus unreasonable faith. It may surprise you to see just who is practicing the bad science, and just who has the unreasonable faith. As we've mentioned before, science is a search for causes. Logically, there are only 2 types of causes, intelligent and non-intelligent. Natural. The Grand Canyon had a natural cause, and Mount Rushmore had an intelligent one. Unfortunately, on the question of first life, Darwinists like Dawkins and Crick rule out intelligent causes before they even look at the evidence. In other words, their conclusions are preloaded into their assumptions. Spontaneous generation by natural laws must be the cause of life, because they consider no other options. 2 types of causes, intelligent, Mount Rushmore, natural, Grand Canyon. Spontaneous generation is what critics of evolution call a just so story. Evolutionists provide no evidence to support spontaneous generation. It isn't supported by empirical observation or forensic science principles. It's just so because life exists, and since intelligent causes are ruled out in advance, there can be no other possible explanation. The problem for Darwinists is immense. Biochemist Claus Dose admits that more than 30 years of research into the origin of life has led to a better perception of the immensity of the problem of the origin of life on Earth, rather than to its solution. At present, all discussions on principal theories and experiments in the field either end in stalemate or in a confession of ignorance. Francis Crick laments, "Every time I write on a paper on the origin of life, I swear I will never write another one, because there is too much speculation running after too few facts." The evidence is so strong for intelligence and against naturalism that prominent evolutionists have actually suggested aliens deposited the first life here. Fred Hoyle, the same evolutionist who popularized the steady-state theory we discussed in Chapter 3, invented this far-out theory called panspermia, for seeds everywhere, after calculating that the probability of life arising by spontaneous generation was effectively zero. Of course, panspermia doesn't solve the problem. It simply puts it off another step. Who made the intelligent aliens? As crazy as the theory sounds, at least panspermia advocates recognize that some kind of intelligence must be behind the amazing wonder we call life. Still, when top evolutionists have to resort to aliens to explain the origin of life, you know the simplest life must be incredibly complex. Another panspermia advocate, Chandra Wickramasinghe, admits that the Darwinists are acting on blind faith when it comes to spontaneous generation. He observes, "The emergence of life from a primordial soup on the earth is merely an article of faith that scientists are finding difficult to shed. There is no experimental evidence to support this at the present time. Indeed, all attempts to create life from non-life, starting from Pasteur, have been unsuccessful." Microbiologist Michael Denton, though himself an atheist, adds, "The complexity of the simplest known type of cell is so great that it is impossible to accept that such an object could have been thrown together suddenly by some kind of freakish, vastly improbable event. Such an occurrence would be indistinguishable from a miracle." In light of just so explanations such as spontaneous generation and panspermia, who do you think is practicing the bad science? The people derisively called religious, the theist creationists, or the enlightened ones, the atheist Darwinists, who are really just as religious as the religious? Physicist and information scientist Hubert Yockey realizes it's the Darwinists. He writes, "The belief that life on Earth arose spontaneously from non-living matter is simply a matter of faith in strict reductionism and is based entirely on ideology." Yockey is right. Darwinists falsely believe they can reduce life to its non-living chemical components. That's the ideology of reductionism. For Darwinists like Dawkins or Crick, who must believe that only the material and the immaterial exist, then life can be nothing more than chemicals. But life is clearly more than chemicals. Life contains a message, DNA, that is expressed in chemicals, but those chemicals cannot cause the message any more than chemicals in ink and paper can cause the sentences on this page. A message points to something beyond chemicals. The message in life, just like the one in this page, points to an intelligence beyond its chemical elements. We realize that life is certainly more than chemicals with a message, but the key point here is that it's certainly not less. So by blind allegiance to this naturalistic reductionist ideology, which is against all observation and reason, Darwinists dogmatically assert that life arose spontaneously from its non-living chemical components. Ironically, this is exactly what Darwinists have long accused creationists of doing, allowing their ideology to overrule observation and reason. In truth, it's the Darwinists who are allowing their faith to overrule observation and reason. Creationists and intelligent design proponents are simply making a rational inference from the evidence. They are following the evidence exactly where it leads, back to an intelligent cause. Yockey is not the only one pointing out that Darwinists have a philosophical bias against intelligent causes. Philip Johnson serves as the sharp edge of a steel wedge that is now splitting the petrified wood of naturalism in the scientific community. He correctly points out that Darwinism is based on an a priori, prior, commitment to materialism, not on a philosophically neutral assessment of the evidence. Separate the philosophy from the science, and the proud tower collapses. And it's not just the critics of evolution who see this bias. Prominent Darwinists admit it as well. In fact, Dawkins himself has acknowledged the bias in responding to an email question from Philip Johnson. Our philosophical commitment to materialism and reductionism is true, Dawkins wrote, but I would prefer to characterize it as a philosophical commitment to a real explanation, as opposed to a complete lack of an explanation, which is what you espouse. Dawkins may think he has a real explanation, but, as we have seen, his explanation is against all of the observational and forensic evidence. If Richard Dawkins leaks out a half-hearted admission of bias, Darwinist Richard Lewontin of Harvard University gushes a complete written confession. Read how Lewontin acknowledges that Darwinists accept absurd just-so stories that are against common sense because of their prior commitment to materialism. Our willingness to accept scientific claims that are against common sense is the key to an understanding of the real struggle between science and the supernatural. We take the side of science in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs, in spite of its failure to fulfill many of its extravagant promises of health and life, in spite of the tolerance of the scientific community for unsubstantiated just-so stories, because we have a prior commitment to materialism. It is not that the methods and institutions of science somehow compel us to accept a material explanation of the phenomenal world, but, on the contrary, that we are forced by our a priori adherence to material causes to create an apparatus of investigation and a set of concepts that produce material explanations, no matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. Moreover, that materialism is absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. Now the real truth comes out. It's not that the evidence supports Darwinism. In fact, according to Lewontin and our own common sense, Darwinist explanations are counterintuitive. The real truth is that the Darwinists have defined science in such a way that the only possible answer is Darwinism. Any other definition would, God forbid, allow God to get his foot in the door. In the next chapter, we'll investigate the possible motivations for keeping God out. For now, the bottom line is this. The event required to get the atheistic theory of macroevolution off the ground, the spontaneous generation of first life, is believed because of false philosophical assumptions disguised as science, not because there are legitimate scientific observations that support spontaneous generation. False science is bad science, and it's the Darwinists who are practicing it. Their belief in spontaneous generation results from their blind faith in naturalism. It takes tremendous faith to believe that the first one-celled creature came together by natural laws, because that's like believing 1,000 encyclopedias resulted from an explosion in a printing shop. Atheists can't even explain the origin of the printing shop, much less the 1,000 encyclopedias. Therefore, we don't have enough faith to be atheists. Give time and chance a chance. Not so fast, say the Darwinists. You've overlooked time and chance as plausible explanations for how life's spontaneously generated. Give time more time. Darwinists dismissed the conclusion that intelligence was necessary for the first life by suggesting that more time would allow natural laws to do their work. Give it several billion years, and eventually we'll get life. Is this plausible? Let's go back to Mount Rushmore for a minute. Darwinists assert that science is built on observation and repetition. Okay, suppose we observe and repeat an experiment where we allow natural laws to work on rock for the next 10 years. Will we ever get the faces on Mount Rushmore? Never. You say, maybe natural laws would do it if we give them billions of years. No, they wouldn't. Why? Because nature disorders. It doesn't organize things. The fact that nature brings things toward disorder is another aspect of the second law of thermodynamics. Much more will make things worse for the Darwinists, not better. How so?